In the calm of a suburban neighborhood, where neatly trimmed lawns and quiet streets gave the illusion of safety, Rebecca Miller and Daniel Hayes lived in a house that appeared as flawless as their marriage looked from the outside. To the neighbors, they were a model couple. Rebecca was admired for her warmth and reliability, often seen chatting kindly with other mothers at school pickup, while Daniel was known for his discipline and success, a businessman who seemed to carry the weight of responsibility without complaint. Together, they projected stability, a picture of domestic harmony that others envied. Yet within the walls of their home, the distance between them grew larger with each passing day, invisible to outsiders but impossible for them to ignore. The problems in their marriage did not erupt suddenly. Rather, they crept in quietly, like cracks forming beneath the surface of a structure that still looked strong. Daniel worked long hours, often coming home late, distracted and exhausted. He saw his dedication as sacrifice, necessary for maintaining the life they had built, but to Rebecca, it felt like abandonment. She longed for presence, for intimacy, for something that resembled the connection they once shared. Evenings became routine exercises in silence, where Daniel immersed himself in work emails or television while Rebecca tidied up, her thoughts circling around the growing void. It was during this fragile time that Michael Turner entered Rebecca's life. He was hired as a contractor to renovate parts of the house, a man with easy charm and an energy that contrasted sharply with Daniel's fatigue. At first, their conversations were casual, nothing beyond the ordinary exchanges between homeowner and worker. Yet Rebecca noticed the way Michael looked at her, not with detachment, but with curiosity, as though she was more than just a woman waiting for her husband's attention. Those looks, those small moments of recognition, sparked something inside her that she thought had long since faded. The transition from small talk to something deeper happened gradually. A cup of coffee offered during his workday turned into extended conversations about music, books, and dreams she hadn't dared to share in years. Michael's words carried a lightness that contrasted with Daniel's clipped tones, and Rebecca found herself craving these interactions more than she admitted. It wasn't just Michael she was drawn to, it was the reflection of herself that emerged in his presence. With him she felt seen, appreciated, alive. When their relationship finally crossed the boundary into an affair, it was less a sudden decision and more a culmination of months of hidden yearning. The secrecy itself heightened the thrill, sneaking away for stolen hours, sending hushed messages in the late evening, and returning home with her secret locked tightly inside, gave Rebecca a sense of control she hadn't felt in years. She told herself she was still the same devoted wife and mother, that this private world with Michael existed in its own compartment, separate from her family life. The guilt that occasionally pricked at her was quickly drowned out by the exhilaration of passion. Daniel, meanwhile, remained largely unaware of the truth, though he sensed a shift. Rebecca seemed distracted at times, her eyes distant even when she was sitting right beside him. She laughed less with him, but she laughed with someone, and he felt that absence like a weight pressing on his chest. He rationalized it as stress or exhaustion, never imagining that his wife could be sharing the very intimacy he had withheld with another man. For Daniel, ignorance was a temporary shield, one that allowed him to maintain the illusion of control over his orderly life. Rebecca believed she could sustain both lives, that her careful attention to detail would prevent discovery. She kept up with her responsibilities at home, never missing a school event, never failing to prepare dinner, never letting her mask slip in front of the children. To her friends, she was the same Rebecca they always knew, warm and steady, yet beneath her calm exterior was a woman caught between two worlds, tethered by duty but intoxicated by desire. She underestimated the risks. Affairs, no matter how carefully managed, leave traces, an unwashed glass in the sink, a receipt tucked away, a subtle change in demeanor that those closest eventually notice. Rebecca convinced herself that she was in control, but the truth was that she was walking a narrowing path where exposure lurked at every turn. She did not see the storm gathering on the horizon, nor did she sense that Daniel's quiet observations would one day give way to something far darker than she could have imagined. The affair, in its early stages, felt like a secret escape, a rebellion against the emptiness that had hollowed her marriage. but in its shadows, danger was already forming. What Rebecca saw as freedom was planting the seeds of destruction. Not just for her but for everyone entangled in the web she had spun. She thought she could live two lives, but both were slowly pulling her toward a fate she could neither anticipate nor escape. Daniel Hayes had always considered himself a man who could read people, a skill that had carried him far in business. Yet when it came to his own home, his instincts were slower to catch on. At first, the changes in Rebecca were subtle, small enough that he dismissed them without much thought. She was quicker to put her phone face down on the counter, often leaving the room when it buzzed. She lingered longer in front of the mirror before going out, her outfits carefully chosen in a way that felt less casual and more intentional. Even during family dinners, her eyes seemed distant, as though her thoughts were somewhere far away. Daniel told himself these were harmless signs of distraction, but the quiet doubts began to pile up in his mind. One evening, Daniel returned home earlier than expected. The house was neat, the children asleep upstairs, but in the sink sat two wine glasses, one with traces of red still at the bottom. Rebecca explained with casual ease that a neighbor had stopped by, and Daniel nodded, outwardly accepting the story. But the explanation did not settle the unease within him. He noticed the way she avoided his eyes when she said it, the slight tremor in her tone. The man who built his career on noticing details could no longer ignore the inconsistency staring him in the face. Suspicion became an unwelcome companion. Daniel found himself replaying moments in his mind, looking for signs he had missed. He began watching her more closely, memorizing the rhythm of her days. When she said she was meeting a friend, he noted the time she left and returned. When she took calls in hushed tones, he strained to catch even fragments of her words. What he discovered was not definitive proof, but enough to deepen the crack of doubt into something far more consuming. Driven by unease, Daniel made a decision he once would have thought beneath him. He followed Rebecca. On a quiet afternoon, when she said she was running errands, he trailed her car at a distance, his hands tight on the steering wheel, his pulse heavy with dread. He watched as she parked at a small cafe on the edge of town, a place far enough from their neighborhood to avoid familiarity. Moments later, another car arrived. Michael Turner stepped out, the contractor Daniel had met briefly during the renovations months earlier. He watched Rebecca's face light up as she greeted him, a smile Daniel hadn't seen in years. In that instant, Daniel's world fractured. The betrayal was undeniable. Yet he remained still, watching as the woman he shared his life with leaned in close to another man, her body language unguarded, her affection visible. A rush of anger surged through him, but it was accompanied by something sharper, a cold humiliation that cut deeper than rage. His wife had chosen another man, and worse, she had done it so openly that he had uncovered it without effort. Daniel did not confront her. Not that day, nor the days that followed. Instead, he returned home in silence, his face betraying nothing of the storm inside. He carried the knowledge like a burning coal, hidden but scolding, waiting for the right moment. He understood that an impulsive reaction could destroy him in ways he wasn't prepared for. Divorce was not an option he considered lightly. It would mean scandal, financial exposure, and the dismantling of the image he had built for himself in the community. More than anything, it would mean admitting that his wife had fooled him. Rebecca, unaware of what her husband had seen, carried on as though nothing had changed. She believed she was careful enough, clever enough, to keep her two lives separate. She went about her routines, slipping in and out of her secret world with Michael, never realizing that Daniel's silence was not ignorance, but calculation. She thought the small deceptions, an invented errand here, a white lie there, were holding everything together. What she did not know was that Daniel was no longer the trusting partner she assumed him to be. He was watching, waiting, and planning. The betrayal did not simply wound Daniel, it reshaped him. Each night, as Rebecca drifted off to sleep, he lay awake, his thoughts circling the same questions. Why had she done it? Why wasn't he enough? And more dangerously, how could he make her pay without destroying himself in the process? The answers he began to form were darker than he admitted even to himself. It was no longer enough to expose her or walk away. For Daniel, this was not just infidelity. It was humiliation. And humiliation, to him, was unforgivable. He began noticing details about Michael too. Where he lived, the kind of car he drove, the way he casually interacted with Rebecca. To anyone else, these might have been irrelevant observations, but to Daniel, they were pieces of a puzzle. Fragments he tucked away for later use. He never allowed his mask to slip. At home, he remained the composed husband, attentive enough not to raise suspicion, distant enough that Rebecca believed he was still lost in work. Beneath the surface, however, something far more dangerous was taking shape. Rebecca, lost in the thrill of her affair, did not sense the danger growing beside her. She believed her secret was safe, her tracks covered. She did not realize that Daniel had already seen the truth, and that his silence was not mercy, but a weapon. The marriage she thought she was balancing was no longer a fragile coexistence. It was a trap slowly tightening around her, built not from anger alone, but from cold, deliberate calculation. Daniel's discovery of Rebecca's affair did not break him in the way some might expect. He did not explode in anger or confront her with accusations. Instead, the revelation ignited a quiet obsession that began to consume him. He went about his days with the same measured composure he always displayed. But underneath, every thought circled back to Rebecca and Michael. It was not enough to know she had betrayed him. He needed to understand every detail of it, every hidden layer she thought he could not see. The sharp sting of humiliation carved itself deeper into him with each passing day, and he resolved not to be the man who was deceived, pitied, or laughed at. He began collecting evidence, not with the intent to hand it over to lawyers or investigators, but for himself. At first, it was small, receipts he found tucked in Rebecca's purse. The faint smell of cologne on her clothes, that was not his, or the unfamiliar songs she suddenly played in the car, which he later learned were among Michael's favorites. Soon, he escalated. He followed her discreetly on afternoons, when she claimed to be running errands, snapping photographs from a distance as she met Michael. He noted the addresses, the times, the patterns of her movements. Every new discovery did not bring relief, but sharpened the edge of his anger. Rebecca, meanwhile, was drifting further into the affair. What had begun as stolen moments had grown into something bolder. She spent weekends pretending to visit relatives, but instead disappearing into Michael's world. He rented a modest apartment, a temporary sanctuary where they could exist without pretense. Within those walls, Rebecca allowed herself to imagine a future where she could shed the weight of her marriage entirely. Michael, passionate and reckless, encouraged her fantasies, never realizing that their secrecy was fragile and that Daniel's watchful eyes had already pierced it. The more Daniel observed, the more he became convinced that Rebecca was preparing to leave him. When he noticed money missing from their joint account, small amounts at first, then larger sums, his suspicion turned into certainty. She wasn't simply indulging in an affair, she was laying the foundation for an escape, one that would strip him of everything he had worked for and expose him to public shame. For Daniel, this was no longer a matter of infidelity. It was an attack on his identity, his pride, and the image of control he had cultivated his entire life. What made Daniel dangerous was not the depth of his anger, but the precision of his mind. He approached the problem the way he approached business decisions. Methodically, strategically, without letting emotion dictate his moves. He studied their schedules, their routines, the weaknesses in their carefully concealed relationship. He rehearsed scenarios in his head, eliminating ones that left too many loose ends and refining others, until the plan seemed seamless. The thought of divorce, once a possible solution, now felt insufficient. Divorce would leave scars on his reputation and embolden Rebecca, proving that she could dismantle him without consequence. He wanted more than escape, he wanted finality. Rebecca remained oblivious to the danger. To her, Daniel was distant but unchanged, preoccupied with work as he always had been. She interpreted his silence as indifference, never imagining it was the silence of a man plotting. The nights she returned home late, flushed with excitement from Michael's embrace, Daniel often pretended to be asleep. In reality, he was wide awake, cataloging every detail she inadvertently revealed. Her scent, her expressions, the rhythm of her breathing. All were clues in the puzzle he was piecing together. The double life, Rebecca believed she controlled so carefully, was unraveling, but not in the way she feared. She had imagined being caught, perhaps confronted, perhaps even divorced. What she never anticipated was the patience of a man who valued control above all else. Daniel's silence was not forgiveness, nor was it surrender. It was the mask of someone who intended to take back power in the most permanent way possible. As the weeks turned into months, the inevitability of what Daniel planned grew heavier. He no longer entertained thoughts of salvaging the marriage or reclaiming Rebecca's loyalty. That possibility had died the moment he watched her smile at another man. What remained was a singular focus: to erase the humiliation, to ensure that neither Rebecca nor Michael could continue to undermine the life he had built. He became colder, sharper, driven not by passion but by the clarity of purpose. The meticulous attention to detail that once earned him respect in business now fueled something far darker. Each receipt, each photograph, each observation became part of the architecture of his plan. He was careful never to reveal what he knew, never to let Rebecca sense the shift in his intentions. To her he remained the distant husband she had already written off. To him, she was no longer his wife, but the center of a betrayal that could only be resolved through destruction. The breaking point was not sudden but steady, an accumulation of small cuts that had bled into something irreversible. Daniel's world had been carefully crafted around the image of control, and Rebecca's betrayal had shattered that image. Now only one solution seemed acceptable: to take back the control she had stolen from him, not through words or separation, but through an act so final that no one could ever question his dominance again. The night Daniel chose to act was carefully selected, not rushed or born from impulse. He had studied Rebecca's habits long enough to know when she would be most vulnerable, when her guard would be down and when Michael would be expecting her. It was a crisp autumn evening, the kind where the air carried the faint scent of burning leaves and the streets grew quiet earlier than usual. Rebecca thought she was heading to a rendezvous with Michael, believing she had orchestrated the night with her usual secrecy. In truth, Daniel had intercepted her messages, using his knowledge of her patterns to construct a trap that neither she nor Michael would see coming. He had created confusion between them, sending altered details that left Michael waiting at one location while Rebecca drove to another. To her, the destination seemed plausible, just secluded enough to give them privacy. She never questioned it because she trusted the rhythm of their affair, the ease with which they had hidden it for months. But trust in secrecy is often the greatest weakness, and Daniel exploited it with precision. Rebecca arrived at the property expecting passion, but was met with silence. The house stood empty, its windows dark, only sound the crunch of gravel under her tires as she parked. She stepped out of the car, her breath visible in the cold night air, and walked toward the door with a mixture of anticipation and curiosity. Inside, Daniel waited. He had already rehearsed every detail in his mind, from the moment she crossed the threshold to the moment her life would end. The mask he wore was no longer the mask of a betrayed husband, but that of a man who had resolved to finish what humiliation had started. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting or pleading. Daniel was not interested in explanations or apologies. For him, the decision had already been made. The years of resentment, the wound of betrayal, and the desire for control all converged into a single moment of brutality. Rebecca did not have the chance to fight or bargain. The violence was swift, calculated, stripped of emotion in the way only a man consumed by cold obsession could deliver. In those final moments, the passion that had once defined her affair dissolved into silence, leaving behind nothing but the consequence of choices she believed were hidden. Daniel worked quickly after. He had prepared for this night with the same meticulous care he applied to his career. The tools, the location, even the shallow grave waiting on the outskirts of the property, all of it had been arranged in advance. He moved Rebecca's body under the cover of darkness, ensuring no witnesses, no stray eyes to catch the truth. The act itself did not feel chaotic or reckless. To Daniel it was the execution of a plan, the completion of a decision he had been building toward for weeks. By the time dawn began to break, Daniel had returned home. The house looked unchanged, the children still asleep upstairs, unaware of the absence that would soon redefine their lives. He rehearsed his alibi in his head, each step designed to appear natural, believable, unshaken. When Rebecca's disappearance became public, he would not be the husband consumed by guilt. He would be the grieving partner, the man blindsided by loss, whose steady composure made him a pillar of strength in a moment of tragedy. When Rebecca failed to return, the alarm grew slowly. At first, Daniel feigned confusion, asking friends if they had seen her, making calls that seemed genuine in their urgency. Soon after, he reported her missing, his voice carrying the weight of worry that no one doubted. Neighbors rallied around him, offering sympathy and support, moved by what they believed was a man enduring the unimaginable. His performance was flawless, the mask fitting so tightly that even those closest to him saw no cracks. Michael, however, was less composed. He had spent the night waiting at the location he believed Rebecca had chosen, growing restless with each passing hour. By morning, his confusion turned to panic, and when news of her disappearance spread, his role in her life began to unravel. Though he was the obvious suspect in the eyes of investigators, Michael's shock and lack of preparation stood in stark contrast to Daniel's steady performance. Still, suspicion lingered, and the affair that Rebecca thought she had hidden so carefully was now exposed under the harsh light of scrutiny. For a brief time, Daniel's plan seemed untouchable. He played the part of the devastated husband so convincingly that sympathy shielded him from suspicion. He gave interviews, organized searches, and stood beside detectives with an air of quiet despair. Yet beneath it all was the satisfaction of believing he had restored control, that he had silenced the betrayal that threatened to unravel him. What he did not anticipate was that secrets, no matter how carefully buried, have a way of surfacing. He had erased Rebecca, but the traces of his actions lingered in places he overlooked, threads that investigators would soon begin to pull. The autumn night that ended with Rebecca's life buried in the cold earth marked a turning point, not just for Daniel, but for everyone entangled in the story. What had begun as whispers of infidelity had escalated into a crime that would shake the community, a crime meticulously planned, yet destined to unravel. Daniel believed he had regained power, but he had only exchanged one kind of exposure for another. The mask of the grieving husband would not hold forever, and the shadows he had created were already beginning to move against him. The days following Rebecca's disappearance unfolded in a haze of confusion and fear for those around her. But Daniel wore his mask with practiced ease. He played the grieving husband with such conviction that few questioned his sincerity. He stood in front of cameras, voice steady yet tinged with sadness, pleading for information about his missing wife. Neighbors brought over food and offered support, moved by what they believed was a tragedy beyond comprehension. In private, Daniel allowed himself moments of grim satisfaction, convinced that he had regained the control Rebecca had tried to take from him. For a time it seemed as though his plan had worked perfectly. But control is fragile, and secrets do not stay buried forever. Investigators began to notice cracks in Daniel's story. His recollection of Rebecca's last known movements was oddly precise, as though rehearsed rather than remembered. He repeated details with a stiffness that felt unnatural, raising quiet doubts among those trained to hear inconsistencies. More troubling were the phone records, which revealed that Rebecca's calls and messages on the night she vanished did not align with the timeline Daniel provided. When investigators pressed him, his explanations seemed careful, but not convincing. Attention quickly turned to Michael Turner. As the man entangled in Rebecca's affair, he was the obvious suspect. Michael did himself no favors at first, his nervousness and grief painting him as unstable. He admitted to the affair without hesitation, confessing to investigators how deeply he had fallen for Rebecca. He explained how she was supposed to meet him that night but never arrived, and how he had waited for hours before realizing something was wrong. For detectives, his cooperation was both a revelation and a complication. His testimony exposed the secret Rebecca had tried so hard to keep hidden. But it also shifted suspicion. Michael had no clear motive for harming her. If anything, he had been planning a future with her. The absence of physical evidence against him forced investigators to look elsewhere. It was then that Daniel's careful construction began to collapse. Forensic teams found subtle but damning traces in his car. Fibers from Rebecca's clothing, faint but undeniable, and soil that matched the remote property where she had last been seen. Though he had worked meticulously to cover his tracks, perfection is impossible in the real world. Each overlooked detail became a thread for investigators to pull, and soon a picture emerged that contradicted Daniel's performance as the devoted husband. The turning point came with the discovery of Rebecca's remains. Buried in a shallow grave near the secluded property, her body revealed the truth Daniel had tried to erase. The evidence connected him directly to the crime, dismantling the image he had worked so hard to maintain. When confronted, Daniel did not erupt in denial or outrage. He remained calm, even as the walls closed in around him, his silence now seen not as strength, but as the chilling composure of a man who believed he could outsmart everyone around him. The trial that followed captivated the community. The story of a husband betrayed, an affair exposed, and a carefully planned murder was almost too dark to comprehend. In the courtroom, Daniel's demeanor unsettled many. He sat quietly, composed, listening without visible remorse as prosecutors detailed the steps he had taken to end his wife's life. The evidence was overwhelming. The altered messages, the surveillance, the forensic links, and the testimony from Michael, who revealed the confusion Daniel had deliberately sown. Piece by piece, the jury watched as the facade of the respectable businessman crumbled, exposing the ruthless mind beneath. When the verdict was read, guilty of murder in the first degree, Daniel showed no emotion. Life in prison was his sentence, a future stripped of the control he had once valued above all else. The man who had built his reputation on discipline and success was reduced to a cautionary tale, a symbol of how pride and obsession can twist into something monstrous. For Michael, freedom came with its own burden. Though cleared of wrongdoing, he carried the weight of guilt, haunted by the belief that his involvement had set the tragedy in motion. Friends distanced themselves, and whispers followed him wherever he went. He became a reminder of the affair that sparked not just heartbreak but death. The community, too, was left shaken. Neighbors who once admired Daniel and Rebecca as an ideal couple struggled to reconcile the image they had believed with the reality that had emerged. The story spread far beyond their town, a chilling example of how passion and secrecy can spiral into violence. The perfect house with its trimmed lawn now stood as a silent reminder of the darkness that had unfolded behind its walls. What began as a marriage strained by distance ended in betrayal, and what began as an affair born of longing ended in death. Daniel's need for control, Rebecca's search for passion, and Michael's reckless devotion collided in a way that none of them could escape. The story's final lesson was stark. Beneath the surface of ordinary lives, destructive forces can grow unseen, fueled by pride, secrecy, and obsession. And when they finally erupt, the result is not just heartbreak, but devastation. The tale of Rebecca Miller's disappearance and murder became more than a local tragedy. It became a reminder that hidden desires and concealed betrayals often carry the heaviest costs, and that in the shadows of love and infidelity, danger is never far behind.